Today's episode on Sports Spectrum is presented by the Sports Spectrum Podcast Network and our brand new podcast produced by Sports Spectrum. It's called Inside the Chapel, hosted by Denver Broncos team chaplain Reza Zadeh and Houston Rockets NBA chaplain Icky Soma. Inside the Chapel takes you where you cannot normally go, and that is inside the locker room to a professional sports team chapel service. And the idea here is we're going to bring to you professional and college team chaplains, sports team chaplains from all realms of sports, men, women, professional, amateur, you name it. And they're going to share their chapel message on this podcast that they would share with their athletes. So this is going to be great. I'm really excited about this show. It's a teaching podcast. It's a little different from what we've done here at Sports Spectrum, but I am so excited for you to hear it. It debuted just a couple weeks ago, and I want you to go check it out right now at sportspectrum.com or everywhere podcasts are found. Spotify, Apple, Google Play, you name it. You can find the brand new Sports Spectrum produced Inside the Chapel podcast available everywhere podcasts are found.
This is Sports Spectrum, the intersection of sports and faith, where we bring Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome to today's show, everyone. I am Jason Romano. This is the Sports Spectrum podcast, bringing Jesus back into the sports conversation. We're so glad that you're tuning into our show today, and we got a great one with Pat Williams. He's the Basketball Hall of Fame executive, the co-founder of the NBA's Orlando Magic, longtime NBA GM with the Philadelphia 76ers, where he won an NBA championship back in 1982. Pat is a legend in the sports business, especially the basketball world. He's been on this show a couple times, and we wanted to have him back on when we knew we'd have an opportunity to talk to him in person. Pat Williams is such a unique individual. This is a man who has authored over 100 books. I think it's something like 117. He tells you that right here at the top. Over 100 books that he's written. He's a motivational speaker. Him and his wife, Ruth, are parents of 19 children, including 14 adopted children and 17 grandchildren. And Pat is a cancer survivor. And he just turned 81 years young last month. And it's fascinating to think about Pat Williams and where God has brought him and to where he is today. He's got a new book out that we're going to talk about. And we also have an amazing conversation about Billy Graham. Pat Williams meeting and interviewing Billy Graham. I loved this conversation, especially because it was in person. We caught up at a conference in Dallas, Texas, and an opportunity to talk about Jesus, basketball, and this new leadership book. Pat Williams, the Basketball Hall of Fame executive, is our guest today on Sports Spectrum. Let's take a listen. It is an honor and a privilege to welcome back to the show the great Pat Williams, the Hall of Famer, the longtime Orlando Magic executive, co-founder of the Orlando Magic, former GM with the Sixers, among many other titles. Author of how many books now, Pat?
Well, Jason, my latest is just out. It's called Revolutionary Leadership, and if my count is accurate, it's 117, which my high school English teacher would not believe. He would be stunned.
117 books. I told you this the last time. I have written 2, and I can't even imagine getting to 4 or 5, and you've done 117. That's amazing. Let's start with the new book, and then we'll kind of get into some storytelling. Revolutionary Leadership, Essential Lessons from the Men and Women of the American Revolution. This is fascinating. Why this topic and the idea of going all the way back to the Revolutionary War to take those lessons and bring them into today?
Jason, I've got a number of interests in life. One of them is American history, and I grew up with that. My dad was a high school history teacher, baseball coach. My mother was an absolute American patriot. And so growing up near Philadelphia, Wilmington, Delaware, I was exposed to all the history in Philadelphia as a youngster. Valley Forge, everything in the city of Philadelphia, and Wilmington had some history as well. So that was the first thing. And then secondly, years back, I became absolutely fascinated with leadership. What does it take to be a great leader? And I began to study the great leaders of history. Well, combined my interest in history and my interest in leadership, and the thought was, who were these leaders during that pivotal time when our country was formed? Who were these men and women? And how did they lead? And what did they do? And what can we learn from them as leaders? So that's how it started, and we began to explore who deserved to be in the book. We ended up with 25 chapters, 25 people. I'm sure we left some out, which I hated to do, but there they are. So many are famous, George Washington and Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and so forth, but there are many that are not that famous, but yet were key contributors. So there's a wide range of different personalities that we get into, and it's very interesting, Jason. And when I came away, the thought is that our country is an absolute miracle. We had no right to beat the British. They were the dominant force on earth at the time. They were a power, the power. And our little stragglers here, we had no army. We had no weaponry, really. We really didn't have much of anything except leadership. That's the one thing we had. And that's where we dominated the British.
What's the one leadership trait, and there's many of them, we don't want to give them all away, we want people to buy the book, but what's the one leadership trait that you can share with our audience that stands out when you think about the Revolutionary War and those times? Maybe it's some of the famous people that you referred to, but what's one of the lessons that, as our listeners are tuning in, can take away and say, yeah, okay, that one, I see where you're going here, Pat?
I think it would be vision, Jason. These men and women saw the future before it got here. They, in their minds, they already saw a new nation independent of Great Britain's rule. And then they simply had to work backwards, putting the pieces in place to turn that vision into reality. Well, the timeline in working backwards was 8 years. 8 years of a very, very difficult war. Many times it looked like we were not going to make it. It was going to be a collapse. The British, particularly early in the war, had a chance to just wipe us out. But we had one great advantage, and that was George Washington, the father of our country. And he truly was the father of our country. Without him, we don't win the war. He became our first president. Set the standard for all presidents down the line since then. But he was the go-to guy. He was the one that kept the whole thing together through tough times. Soldiers weren't getting paid. We were low on ammunition. We were low. Feeding the troops went poorly. It was really, really, really a difficult time, but somehow or other, Washington kept the whole thing going, and so he is the hero here. Much to learn from him, and I want youngsters particularly to really understand how this country was formed and how it started, and why it really is a miracle. God oversaw the whole thing, I'm convinced, and the miracle of the United States should always be foremost in our minds.
Here's Pat Williams. Again, the new book is called Revolutionary Leadership, Essential Lessons from the Men and Women of the American Revolution. It's out now. People can go get it everywhere books are found. 117 books. You talked about vision. You're a guy who had vision for a while in many aspects of your journey. But I want to go back to when you first started your walk with Christ and how that's kind of set the trajectory of the journey that you've taken since then. Can you share your story and your testimony? I think you've shared it before, but I'd love to hear it again for our audience.
Well, I grew up in a church going home. My mother dragged us off to Westminster Presbyterian Church, all through my youth. And then I went to a Baptist college at the time, Wake Forest. My dorm room was right next to the chapel. So I had a certain amount of religion But it was later on, I was in my mid-20s, running the Phillies minor league ball club in Spartanburg, South Carolina, having wonderful success personally and collectively, and it was we were the hot minor league team, and I was riding shotgun, and but I after these great triumphs and these awards, there was an emptiness, and I was confused, thinking, boy, I thought that was the answer, just getting enough publicity and getting enough recognition and enough success, and that would do it, but it didn't do it. It left an emptiness there. And so in my I guess I was 27 years old, I began to hear different athletes, Paul Anderson and Bobby Richardson, sharing their faith, talking about this personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I'd never heard that before. But there in Spartanburg, right there in the middle of the Bible Belt, I was surrounded with all these different things, but it hadn't hit. And finally, I was 27 years old. I realized I'd tried everything else to find fulfillment in life. So why not give this Jesus thing a shot? Well, let me just give you caution. If you sincerely invite him into your life, and I did, he is coming in. And he's going to plant the Holy Spirit in your heart, and that Holy Spirit's not leaving. And so that's what happened to me. It was a dramatic Damascus Road experience. I'm living proof that you can have instantaneous conversion. And so at the age of 27, one day I was walking this way, and 24 hours later I was heading in a completely opposite direction, and I just surrendered my life to Christ, and I said, Lord, if I'll stay in Spartanburg my whole career if that's what you want. And I don't know, about 5 months later, Jack Ramsey called from the 76ers, inviting me to join and help run the front office. So I go from Spartanburg, South Carolina to Philadelphia in one swoop, and it was a God thing. I had tried to maneuver my way to the top of my profession for years, but nothing had happened. And then God just said, "Okay, you're mine now, and I'm gonna lead it from here on." And so all the steps of my career, from Spartanburg to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Chicago, Chicago to Atlanta, Atlanta back to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Orlando. I didn't know about any of them, but yet they appeared, and all I could say was, "Lord, I'm in your hands here." So
I love that. It's a great story, and it's interesting to follow the trajectory of your career as God kind of directed your paths. And I think about Sports Spectrum and what we are about. In 1985 is when Sports Spectrum was born, and on the cover of our first magazine was Dr. J, Julius Erving, who you were around quite a bit when you were with the 76ers. And I remember you telling me a story, and I want you to share it again if you could, about the idea of chapel services coming into the NBA. And I think it was in your time in Philadelphia that the idea to bring a chapel service and offer that to players and anyone else that wanted to participate was born. Can you kind of share that story about the idea that you helped conceive and bring chapel to the NBA?
Well, actually, it was a ball player by the name of Bobby Jones. We made a trade in the summer of '78. We sent George McGinnis to Denver, and Bobby Jones came to us in Philadelphia. And the first time I met him, Bobby said to me, "I would like to have a chapel, with my teammates. Can you help me?" And so the first Sunday of that season, it was actually in early '79, the '78-'79 season, Milwaukee was in town, Sunday afternoon game, and I found a room. I got a speaker, and we had a little press release to the players. I do remember Bobby Jones was there, Kent Benson from Milwaukee, Dr. J came, and Chuck Daly, who was then an assistant on our staff. They were the ones who were there. And the service, black inner city former policeman Mel Floyd was the speaker. And as far as I can determine, that's when basketball chapel arrived. It was in its very infant stages. Well, at this point in the NBA, every team has their own chaplain, and they meet before every game in a private room down somewhere in the bowels of that arena. Two teams come together voluntarily. You never know who's going to show up, but there they are to hear a short challenge from the Word of God, and then they pray together, and then they head back to their locker room and get ready for the game. It's a powerful thing to watch. And then soon thereafter, the idea came for the All-Star weekend, a chapel service. And so that started in '81 and now has been running for 40 years. I still have the privilege of lining up the speakers and getting the invites out for that All-Star Chapel, and it's become a major part of the All-Star Weekend. Many people just really look forward to that. So God is working in sports. The Fellowship of Christian Athletes is alive and well. Athletes in Action is alive and well. There's some good things happening in the world of sports spiritually. So I'm encouraged.
Let's take a quick break to tell you again about our Sports Spectrum magazine, available now for just $18 for a 1-year subscription, just $30 for a 2-year subscription. I think it's the best thing that we do here at Sports Spectrum, and you can subscribe right now at sportspectrum.com. It's super easy. You click on the magazine icon at the website, and you're good to go. You can actually get a digital version of the magazine to complement the print version that you will get in the mail when you subscribe to the Sports Spectrum magazine. It is a great resource. I tell people the magazine, it's not your typical magazine that you just pick up and kind of peruse through. This is one that I think is a resource for you as you continue in your ministry. And whether you're a coach or a teacher or a pastor or a leader, wherever you are, whatever influence you have, knowing that you want to share the gospel, maybe use sports as a gateway to share the gospel, the Sports Spectrum magazine is a great resource for you. It might be a great resource for someone else. You can get it for yourself, get it as a gift for someone else. Maybe get a bunch and go through it together in a team setting, in a small group setting. But you can subscribe right now at sportspectrum.com. Again, $18 for a 1-year subscription, $30 for a 2-year subscription. Super cheap and available right now to order at sportspectrum.com. Every time we talk about the draft or we see the NBA draft lottery, there's Pat Williams shown on the screen from 1992 when you guys got the number 1 pick with Shaq and Shaquille O'Neal. And then the next year, which was maybe the craziest lottery experience I've ever watched as a fan when I was in my early 20s, and seeing the Magic then get the number 1 pick again. And that was, of course, the Chris Webber, Penny Hardaway trade, which led to Orlando having a lot of success the next few years. What memories come back when you think, because I can't believe that's almost 30 years now when you guys took Shaquille O'Neal number 1. But do you remember that moment of finding out that you got the number 1 pick and you had this game-changing, player who was clearly number 1? There's no kind of maybe this guy or this guy. It was Shaq and then everybody else underneath him. Take me to that moment in 1992, I guess it would have been.
Well, we were still a very new franchise. Our first season was the 89-90 season. And we had gotten off to a nice start. Our fandom was insanely involved, and then there was a little drop off after a couple of years, and then came this draft lottery, and everybody knew Shaq was the player. He was after his junior year at LSU, massive, huge man, and very powerful force. You knew he was going to be a big force. And I do remember that there were 11 teams in the lottery then. They all had brought a Shaq jersey up there because there was not going to be any debate. They had the Shaq jerseys in paper bags, under the desk, hoping to pop them out. Well, they'd keep turning those cards over, with the 11th pick. And now suddenly Orlando hasn't been turned over yet. And now we're down to the final 2. And I tried to get a little peek. I wanted to kind of see if I could see the card being turned over. And And with the second pick, the Charlotte Hornets. And that meant that's all I needed to hear. That meant we had won. And I remember going up to the stage. David Stern was there, and he gave me a big hug. They were very, very happy for us. And that's how Shaq got there. Then the next year, Shaq was very, very good, and we missed the playoffs by the fourth tiebreaker. And that meant we were back in the lottery again with like a 1.5 chance to win it. We were the 11th one. We had one ping pong ball out of 66. One. And our card should have been turned over at 11, and it wasn't. That meant a miracle had happened. Something very strange had happened. Our little ping pong ball, we felt, had battled its way up through the masses of ping pong balls. And there's no question we had trained that ping pong ball. We had worked with him. We had sprinkled pixie dust on him. We had done lots of things, and we'd give him a pep talk.
Whatever it took.
What you got to fight, pal. You got to really overcome. And they kept turning cards, but deep in everybody's mind was, where's Orlando in all this? And they kept turning, and now we're down to 2. And at the second pick, our card was not turned over. And there was just a sense, it was like a gasp. Those suckers won it again? This time, David Stern was not happy to see me, because he sensed that this is not right. You know, these guys won the big one last year, and now they come back, and it was meant to balance. You know, that the worst teams were to get the highest picks, ideally, and there we sat. And David was don't get near me. And I knew right then that they were going to change dramatically the way so that this could never happen again. That the best record in the lottery would never win again.
And it hasn't, right?
No, it's turned out that way. The odds are so distant, you know. That was the Orlando rule. Anyway, we debated what to do, and on the night of the draft, we made a trade with the Warriors. We decided that Penny and Shaq was the best combo, better than a Weber Shaq. So we flip-flop picks. We took Weber. They took Hardaway. They gave us 3 future firsts to make that trade, which was a huge piece of the bank account. And we made the trade, and Penny arrived. He and Shaq for, I guess 93, 94, 95, I guess the 3-4 years they were together, they were a dynamic pair. And we had a lot of success with that group. But unfortunately, Shaq, after 4 years, decided to go to the Lakers as a free agent. Penny's knees gave out, both knees over time, and he never was the same. He now is coaching the University of Memphis and has a whole new career. But that was a key moment in NBA history, I think, that whole 2-year period there.
Yeah.
Then we came back and won another one in 2004, and that was the Dwight Howard draft out of high school. And the key to winning the draft is you hope there's a great player there. Like the Cleveland won it one year, and LeBron James was coming out as a high school kid. But it doesn't happen that way very often, where you get a franchise player with that first pick. There are not many of them.
He is Pat Williams, and he's been joining us here on Sports Spectrum. His new book, again, his 117th book, as far as we know. We might have lost count somewhere, Pat, but Revolutionary Leadership, Essential Lessons from the Men and Women of the American Revolution. All right, I know we're not supposed to do this because you have 117 books. It's like picking your favorite child. But what book or a couple of them maybe stand out that you're most proud of, that you're just so glad that, you know what, I don't know, maybe it was one of your first books, but you're just so glad that you you went down that road and wrote that book. Does one or two come out and stand out?
Well, the first one, came about when I was in Chicago with the Bulls, and then moved to Atlanta, and then after 1 year moved back to Philadelphia. And this book just kept moving with me. And the guy that had came up with the idea and pushed it was a young guy named Jerry B. Jenkins, who has gone on and done a few things in his life. But that's how it all started. So the first book, it was almost like, I can't believe this, that I've done that. I'm 34 years old and I've written my life story. There wasn't much to write about, but there it was. So that was a great thrill. But I've learned this, no matter whether it's book 1 or book 100, when that first copy comes from the publisher and you slice open the package and you've got an idea what it is, and then you pull it slowly, looking, and you see it. There it is. I've poured a lot into this, and there's the finished product. And then you look to make sure it has all its toes and fingers. Did they leave anything out? Or all the blurbs on there? And you just spend, I don't know, many minutes just staring at it. Absolutely. It's quite a feeling. And I've got more in the pipeline, Jason. I've got about 50 more books I want to write.
Wait a minute. Hold on. You want to do 50 more? I was going to ask you that. That was going to be one of my last questions. What's the book that you still want to write? Apparently there's 50?
Yeah, I've got a list at home. I've made the list up. Now here's the key, Jason. Is there a publisher that feels like you do?
True.
And I don't care how long you've been with a publisher. You're only as good as your last book. And so I've already begun to pitch some ideas, and the answer back has been, well, let's see how this book does. And I've done, I don't know how many books I've done with Ravel. Let's just see how this one does before we decide. So you're only as good as your last book, and that's why after you write it, that's just half of it. You got to go out and talk it up.
Like we're doing right now. But what's the one book? Like, give me one of the 50 that you think, man, I would love to write about this someday. What's that? I feel like you've written about everything.
Well, I've written a whole series on Bobby Bowden on leadership, and Bear Bryant on leadership, and Vince Lombardi on leadership, and Tom Osborne on leadership, and John Wooden on leadership, and I think I'd like to do Nick Saban on leadership. That would be interesting. I'd like to do Mike Krzyzewski on leadership. And what that means is you don't need them to do much other than you need names and phone numbers of former players and assistants. But those two would be intriguing.
Two of the greats, two of the all-time greats.
I also would be fascinated to do Billy Graham on leadership. Billy Graham was many things, but he was a leader. Was the leader of the whole, for years, he was the leader of the whole Christian world, I think. And that's another one that would intrigue me.
Did you ever meet Billy Graham or ever seen him? Did you? Tell me the story.
First time I met Billy Graham, I was a senior at Wake Forest. It was the spring of 1962, my senior year, and Billy Graham came to the campus to do a 2-night crusade, I guess you would call it, two-night chapel service. I went both nights, but I was doing a sports talk radio show, and I got a hold of, somehow or other, I got a hold of somebody and asked if I could take my woolen sack and sit down with Billy Graham to talk sports for my sports show, and it happened. That was in the spring of, and that March, our basketball team had really progressed, and they got into the NCAA tournament and then got to the Final Four. This was Billy Packer and Lenny Chappell and all that gang, and that was the week that Billy Graham was there. And I remember somebody said, will you pray for Wake Forest? He said, yeah, I'll pray for Wake Forest. He said, but you better figure out a way to stop Lucas and Havlicek. We were going to open with Ohio State. He said, you better figure out a way to stop those two, but I'll pray for you. So that's when I first met Billy Graham. And then, well, this would be 10, I was 22, 10 years, 10 years later. I'm the GM of the Bulls, and the Billy Graham Crusade is coming to Chicago. And I got a call inviting me to share my testimony at one night at the Graham Crusade. And that was a thrill of a lifetime. And then about 10 years later, another invite to speak at a Graham Crusade in Syracuse, New York. So I do have memories of him. And he was, oh boy, big man, big, 6'3", 6'4", handsome, good head of hair, eyes that would look right through you, but yet a kind man, a caring man, a humble man. And I think the best tribute, a friend of his said to me, here's the best thing about Billy Graham. Whenever a Christian brother stumbled, Billy Graham was the first one at his side. He didn't judge. He was just there to be supportive of a Christian brother. So here's the footnote to it. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Black Mountain, North Carolina. There was an FCA reunion there, and Billy Graham's oldest daughter came, Gigi, and the guy that was running it said, "I'd like you to sit with her during dinner." And I was speaking later that night, and along with Gigi Graham was George Beverly Shea's widow, Carlene Shea. So there they were. So I'm engaged with Billy Graham's oldest daughter the other night, and I do remember saying, anything stuck with you from your dad? He said, well, years ago I was quite young, and my dad said to me, I want you to remember 3 things, Gigi. He said, our job is to love. The Holy Spirit's job is to convict. And it's God's job to judge. And if you'll keep those 3 things in order, you'll do well.
That's a great story.
I wrote that down. That was a keeper. Yeah.
That could be a whole book right there.
Yeah, that was a keeper.
Well, this is Pat Williams. That's a great way to, I think, finish this conversation here in person. And it's so good to see you in person and not just talk over the phone or over Zoom. His new book, again, Revolutionary Leadership, Essential Lessons from the Men and Women of the American Revolution, is available now everywhere books are found. Pat, always a pleasure, my friend. You're welcome back to the show anytime. Thanks so much for being here, and great to see you in person.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to catch up with you as well.
And many thanks to Pat Williams for joining us today on Sports Spectrum. It was so great to catch up with him in person in Dallas, Texas, about a month or so ago. We got the NBA draft coming up, and what great memories when you think about Pat Williams and finding out that the Orlando Magic are going to get the number 1 overall pick back in 1992 and draft Shaquille O'Neal in 1993 and get Penny Hardaway. And there's so many great draft lottery memories and NBA draft memories. Pat Williams was a part of so many of those. And I'm just grateful that he was willing to come on our show and share a little bit about his new book. Again, it's called Revolutionary Leadership, Lessons from Men and Women of the Revolutionary War. And of course, Pat has authored over 100 books on so many different topics. You heard him talk about how he wants to keep writing. And listen, I hope he continues to write because his books are all fantastic. And just love how much he cares about people, how much he loves Jesus. And man, I love sitting down in person with people who have amazing stories, who've seen it all. Pat is 81 years young, so he's been around a long time. And that Billy Graham story was not something that he and I had planned to talk about. But my goodness, I could have listened to him share that story all day long. So appreciate Pat for being here on the show. We appreciate you for listening as well. Before we say goodbye, please do us a favor. Rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It helps get the word out. Tell someone about Sports Spectrum as we continue to bring new people listening to our medium, our Sports Spectrum content, whether it's this podcast, whether it's the other shows on our podcast network, or maybe it's the articles that you've read on our website, or maybe you subscribe to our magazine. and tell someone about the magazine. $18 for an entire year subscription. Our goal is to glorify God and bring Jesus back into the sports conversation. We can't do that without your help. And really what we want to do is provide you with resources to be able to share your faith with others. And there's so many sports fans out there who love Jesus, so many sports fans out there who may not know about Jesus. And hopefully Sports Spectrum can play a little part in you sharing the gospel with someone else. So do us a favor, tell someone about Sports Spectrum, and please do join us next time right here on the show. My name is Jason Romano. If you'd like to reach me, you can email me, jason@sportspectrum.com. That's my email address, jason@sportspectrum.com. Make sure you check out our website, sportspectrum.com, and see you next time right here on the show. Have a great rest of your day.